teams, but also training teams and executive teams in making their Agile more effective. And one of the things that I do in training at the very beginning is to do a go round and have everyone share a little bit of what their experience with Agile is. And I get words like sort of Agile about either their current team or some previous team that people have been on. I hear things like sort of Agile, or we're agile-ish, or they said they were Agile, or we were Agile in name only. I've heard we Frankenstein together an Agile process. I heard this one a few years, just 2 or 3 years ago. I thought that was clever. And then occasionally I hear our executives sprinkled Agile buzzwords across the annual plan like magic fairy dust. And frankly, being Agile-ish just won't cut it anymore. I've got a colleague who does due diligence for private equity companies. And he's got a checklist of things that he goes through with companies that the private equity firm is considering investing in. And one of those very early on, one of those was, are you Agile? Or are you doing Agile? Do you do Agile practices? Everyone checked that box, yes. And he found that he really needed to do a whole bunch of follow-up questions to find out whether they were operating in a way that suggested that they actually understood what being Agile was about. Ken said I'd introduce myself. I was a programmer. When I got into tech as a programmer. This is one of the first programs I wrote. So I was modifying my operating system by writing assembly language that I hand assembled into machine code and plugged into memory locations in my microcomputer. At the time that I got into programming, you could be a single programmer. And in fact, this programmer led a friend of mine to say, I got to hire you. He had himself, one programmer, written one of the popular word processing programs on the Apple II. And he hired me to translate that into another assembly language to make it run on another machine. And that was things that one programmer could do in those days. I was his first employee. So I was the second person in the company. Second programmer in the company, second person in the company. He went from being a single programmer to a team of 2, and we occasionally had a team of 3, but it was still early days. And it wasn't until I got recruited by Apple Computer to come create a product management group for the development tools that I was using. And they were Apple's development tools, and I got recruited to create a product management group for development tools at Apple. And that was my real insight into seeing teams of programmers and testers and product managers all working together. And I was a rookie product manager and a rookie manager. And so I was sort of looked at a little bit askance, but brought into that team and into a sense of teamness that I found pretty powerful. A little bit more about my career. I stayed at Apple for 7 years. I was recruited out of Apple to be a director of engineering. Some of you may be old enough to remember screensavers and After Dark and Flying Toasters. I got to manage families of screensavers being developed at Berkeley Systems, and then online animated virtual worlds, some of the very earliest of those entertainment products, and ended up getting promoted to be a VP of engineering at Charles Schwab, where I spent 7 years. And then 10 years ago, pivoted my career to consulting, to taking on interim VP engineering roles and training teams and executives in making their process more effectively Agile, and really focusing around making software development, helping organizations and helping teams to make their software development more, to make it hum, to translate chaos to clarity. Also 10 years ago, my 5th book, Managing the Unmanageable was coming out. It's one of the very few books on managing software people and teams. There's tons and tons, and I'm sure you all know this, there's tons and tons of books on project management. I'm sure you also all know that there are way fewer books on product management. There are even fewer books on managing the people who deliver projects and products, programmers and programming teams. After beginning to consult, I also became one of the co-authors of the study of product team performance, in which we look for practices. We survey teams all over the world and look at what practices correlate with high performance teams and what practices correlate with low performance teams. And I think I'll share a couple of those with you as we go along. So what we want to talk about today is doing Agile or being Agile, being agile-ish or being Agile, perhaps. Why be Agile? What do we get out of that? And I hope to convince you that being Agile is a good thing, because the next section is on why we're nonetheless too often Agile-ish instead of being Agile, and some symptoms of being Agile-ish, and some suggestions on becoming truly Agile. So I want to start by Kent, if you can run the first poll. I want to start by asking all of you, and so this is anonymous. You're answering the poll is anonymous. We can't track it back to you or your company. So give us a true sense of where do you think your company lies in terms of being Agile? Is it fully Agile at 100%, or is it not Agile at 0%, or is it something in between?
All right, we're getting some good participation here. Just about everybody's responded. We'll give it a few more seconds here. So go ahead and throw in where you think you're at. Interesting spread of results, I would say. All right. Looks like we've got everyone that's going to submit an answer. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Can everybody see the results?
No one feels they're fully Agile, which surprises me. Usually, I have a sense that there's somebody who feels like they're fully Agile. Almost everybody feels like they're either in the middle or in the bottom third, it looks like. So that's really interesting. In fact, let me take a picture of that here before we close that. So give you another second to look at that. try to give a sense of where you're at relative to everyone else. All right. So
you good?
Doing Agile versus being Agile. So what's the difference between doing Agile and being Agile? And I'm going to give you just a really simplistic set of answers, that doing Agile is really about practices and process. There's a bunch of practices out there, there's a bunch of process out there, and being Agile is really about values and principles and mindset. And the practices and process are there to support the values and principles and actually becoming Agile. So there have been for a number of years, and I'm in discussion groups online about Agile, and there have been debates going on about doing Agile versus being Agile. And every once in a while, and I haven't seen this in the last year or so, but every once in a while, there's somebody who says, you can do it. All those doing Agile things, they're useless. Unless you actually are being Agile, they have no value whatsoever. And it led me to just jot down looks like more than a half a dozen, but a half dozen, a few more than that, of just sort of some Agile practices out of Scrum and Kanban and extreme programming, and ask the question. So here's a random sampling that I could just come up with off the top of my head. And I looked down that list, and every single one of those done well, and you might have to be agile to do them well, but done well, every single one of these practices has value for our teams, in my opinion. But I think if you look down them, you're probably not going to see one that you might have some arguments about one or two actually, but done well, they're going to provide some value to your team. So let me transition for a second to let me just tangent. So voting machines. So voting is maybe a practice, maybe it's a process. I don't know whether it's a practice or a process, but it's one or the other. And voting machines are tools that support that practice or process. So do voting and voting machines, that clearly voting and voting machines deliver value, but do they make us a democracy? I see. All right, the one person's picture who I can see is George, and he just shook his head no. So I'll agree with that. No, voting machines do not make us a democracy. We all know that there are countries that have voting. In fact, the world's #1 villain at the moment, Vladimir Putin, has been repeatedly elected after poisoning his opponents and or allegedly poisoning his opponents. Poisoning his opponents and or jailing his opponents and or telling people that there will be bad consequences if they don't go to the polls and vote for him. So we can have voting machines and not be democracies. Democracy actually emanates from values and principles. Similarly, agile practices don't make us agile. Agile practices do deliver better outputs. We'll go back to that list of that sampling that I gave you a minute before. And all of those deliver better outputs, but they don't deliver great teams. Great teams emanate from agile values. So we go back to the original statement of agile values, which is the Agile Manifesto. We see words like these: build projects around motivated individuals, trust to get the job done, face-to-face conversation, self-organizing teams. The team reflects and tunes and adjusts. These are values that inspire great teams. This is a list of core principles that a colleague of mine, Tom Evans, product manager, put together. And notice the first three of those: small, self-organizing teams, communication, collaboration. Software development's a team sport. Team sports are gated on communication and collaboration. And then if you drop down to the second to the bottom one, customer needs. We can't be navel gazing as a team. We need to be outwardly focused to, and the Agile Manifesto says, I think it says satisfying our customers, but I think it understated. I think we need to be delighting our customers. And delighting our customers so I'm fundamentally an engineering manager, but I partner with shoulder to shoulder with product management partners, because we together need to be focused not just on how we build the stuff, but building the right stuff to start with. And that combination, counting on product managers to be out there spending a lot of time with customers and bringing that into the room for the rest of us, and bringing the rest of us into the room with customers, so that we get that interaction and we really can deliver to customer needs, to customer satisfaction, and to customer delight. So being agile it brings us great teams and great teamwork and all of that. So why are any of us agile-ish? What gets in the way? And one of those things is, I think, misunderstandings. And I see this all the time, actually, when I talk with teams about Scrum or extreme programming or Kanban, and when we talk about stand-ups, more often than not, by a lot, what I hear about their stand-ups are that they're status meetings. They were never intended to be status meetings. They were intended to share where are we at and are we on track for meeting some kind of goal in terms of Scrum, in terms of meeting our sprint goal. And too often stand-ups don't get to that. There's misunderstanding of retrospectives and losing sight of the notion of creating an experiment and losing sight of the fact that we can try experiments and that we don't have to settle on something to do it forever, but we can try an experiment and find out whether it brings our team more joy, more productivity, more performance, more quality, better outputs, better results with our customers. So misunderstandings, I think, are definitely one piece of this. Lack of role models, and I'm hoping this is changing. But lack of role models, all of the managers that I had before I became a manager were either micromanagers or the throw people in the deep end and see whether you sink or swim managers. I had two kinds of managers. That's sort of the end of each scale. And that is not the kind of management that supports and enables teams. And part of that comes from history. The Industrial Revolution set up this management style of telling people what to do, of managers knowing more than supposedly knowing more than anyone else and telling people what to do. And we have to get out from under that and actually realize that our role as leaders, our role is to support teams and to enable teams and to create culture in which teams thrive and in which teams can really become agile, really be agile. And get out of cultures that are similarly created from that history, created from that Industrial Revolution kind of history. Douglas McGregor posed some thoughts around management and motivation back in the 1950s and 1960s. He did some work and came up with this X theory, Y theory kind of X theory of management, where people were managers who told people what to do. They were directive, they were micromanaging. And he said, this is what management's been heretofore. This is what came down to us from the Industrial Revolution and before that. And here's Y theory, where the post on the Y, see if I can do that. I can't do that. Oh, there we go. The post on the Y is management supporting the team, and that supporting and enabling teams are what those teams need. And the interesting thing is that if you go back and look at Douglas McGregor's work around theory Y teams, the words he used are the very words that Agile uses to describe the role of leaders. There's servant leaders, supporting, enabling. I don't think he used the word fomenting, but I think fomenting culture that enables great teams to emerge. And then mindset. One of the great joys for me of doing training with teams is seeing teams align around agile process and agile thinking that is a shared mindset that works for their team, that is not my thinking, but it's their thinking, and their thinking coming together instead of a team of 8 or 10 who have 8 or 10 different ideas about what agile is or what process is or how they're going to work together, coming together in a shared mindset. So if we look for symptoms of agile-ish, there's one I already talked about, stand-ups being just status meetings. I looked up Scrum is an interesting term. It's an interesting name for a process. And it's a particularly interesting name for a process in the United States where nobody plays rugby, which is where Scrum comes from. And but you know, all of us probably have got some kind of picture of a rugby scrum in our minds. We've got a whole group of people all pushing each other and pushing the ball in the center around, and we're all muddy and not exactly like a software development team, but we probably got that picture in our minds. But it occurred to me a few years ago to go look up the definition of Scrum. And a scrum is a scrum in rugby. A scrum is a way of restarting the game. A scrum is a way of restarting the game. And in fact, stand up is a term that comes from extreme programming. The word for that in Scrum is Scrum. It's the daily Scrum. It's the moment when, if software development's a team sport, maybe we ought to come together at least once a day and talk with each other. The Scrum is a way of restarting the game, of asking, are we on track for what we intended to do, and can we get back on track if we're not? Or are we ahead and we can fill in and we can solve some other problems? Coming together in that kind of way. If you look at our version, the US version, what I think of as the US version of rugby, it's American football. There's a huddle, one of those scrums, every single play. There's a huddle going on all the time on the field, at least once a day in software development. Maybe we ought to do one of those. No team generated definition of done. So I ran into Agile for the first time when I was at Schwab in the form of extreme programming in 1999. And Schwab at the time measured downtime. If our systems went down, we measured downtime in millions of dollars per minute. It could cost us millions of dollars if our systems were down for a minute. And I was leading an initiative across all of Schwab to move all of Schwab to a single platform. Up until that point, any project team could pick any technology and any language and any framework and any process it wanted. And one of the VPs I was supporting, I was still a director of engineering. One of the VPs I was supporting was doing this thing called extreme programming. And I thought, ooh, extreme anything and millions of dollars per minute in downtime? That sounds weird. I better find out about that. And it turned out that extreme programming was created by this guy named Kent Beck, who I had met when I was at Apple. He was a Smalltalk guy when I was at Apple. Brief flirtation at Apple with Smalltalk before people realized that microprocessors were still too underpowered at that point to support a language as full-fledged as Smalltalk was. And I called Kent and invited him down, brought him down to Schwab, paid him a fair amount of money to come down to Schwab and do some brown bags for us on extreme programming. And from the very beginning, from that moment, and then when I discovered Scrum 3 years later, from that moment, regardless, when teams are working together, one of the things that every team that I worked with was doing was a team-generated definition of done. One of the things I started, and it occurred to me just a few years ago that maybe this is one of the most powerful practices in Agile, is the team coming together and defining what done means. Because unless we do that, we've got as many definitions of done as we have people on our team. So some of you may have had the experience I had early on of a programmer saying to me, I'm done, it compiles, or I'm done, it runs on my machine, or I'm done, it runs in my browser, or I'm done, I checked it in. I actually heard that one. And by coming together as developers and testers and product managers and sometimes designers and writers and asking the question, what would it mean for every single story? What criteria would we apply to every story to say that's done, so that we can move on? So we can move on with confidence that we actually are done. And so I run in teams all the time that use this term done. Some of you may have run across this, or even run across done. That's done. And that's what we're talking about here, is let's be done before we move on to the next thing, so that we can have confidence And so that we don't have to come revisit it at some future time when nobody remembers what they were doing in it, and it takes an order of magnitude longer to solve its problems. Assigning stories, whether it's managers assigning stories to developers or it's product managers assigning stories to sprints. Agile is about the team coming together. So those of you who are product owners, that subset of product management who are product owners, you give us, our teams, a huge blessing in prioritizing a backlog. I think definition of done is one of those things that we got out of Agile. Another one of those things is an ordered backlog. A backlog that's ordered so that when the team comes together and says, what's the next thing to work on, they know that the thing at the top of that backlog is going to deliver more value to our customers and more value to our business than anything else. That's awesome. And that's where it stops. It's not assigning that to the team. It's saying, hey, team, this is the most important thing. This is the thing that's going to deliver the most value. This is the next most value. This is the next most value. That ordered list, there are no two first priorities. There's only one priority, and when the team comes up to it, it can grab that. And that combination of the team self-organizing its work is huge. Stories that are too big. One of the things that every programmer discovers, if they didn't know it inherently, is that the smaller the thing that we can work on to get to success, the more likely that we'll get to success, and the quicker we'll get to success, and the more productive we'll be, and the quicker we can get it out to our customers and get some feedback on it and find out whether we're on track to delivering delight. Having barely a sprint's worth of backlog, having barely a sprint's worth of stories. So I was working with a team, working with a whole organization. I was doing an assessment for a whole organization in Jamaica. And a number of the teams said, you know, we go into plan out, they were working in Scrum, and they said, well, we go into plan out the next 2 weeks of work, and there's not 2 weeks worth of work there on our backlog. And then the converse of that, we've got to have a whole project, a whole product, all figured out and all signed off by the highest level executives before we can even start. It's called working with a team in Denver that the team in Denver is working in Kanban, and they're really highly agile, doing a pretty fair job of being agile. But up front, there's a waterfall process that nothing happens until everything's all signed off, until the whole thing is signed off all at once. And if there are changes, those have to cycle through executive sign-offs as well. Teams not trying new experiments with every sprint. That's the point of a retrospective, is what's one thing we could try that might make our team better? Every once in a while, I hear teams say, well, our team's working pretty well. I don't think we have to do any more experiments. The best teams I've ever seen are always trying experiments. Mike Cohn, who was early in Scrum and is said to have taught the very first Scrum training, and who wrote the book Succeeding with Agile. Mike says that if your team is not better a year from now than they are today, you're not being agile. I have talked to tons of folks in product management, in development, in testing, and I will sometimes, and I've done this multiple times, asked people to think about the best team you've ever been on. Think about the characteristics of the best team you've ever been on. And given people a minute or two to think through their career for the best team they've ever been on, and what the characteristics of that team were that made it that best team. And they'll think through that, and then I'll scribe it. Used to be I was scribing it on poster paper. Now these days scribing it in Miro, or somewhere we can share. Words trust and respect always come up. Someone always brings up at least one of those words, and usually both of them. Trust and respect are core. Google did a study, and I hope all of you have looked into this, because it's now 6 years ago that they did it, the Aristotle study. The Aristotle study, so Google, just like the rest of us, has teams that are high performance and teams that are low performance and teams that are in between. Unlike the rest of us, Google has a ton of money. And they spent some of that money studying their teams. They set up the Aristotle project and the Aristotle team. The Aristotle team went off and studied all their teams, and they went off thinking, oh, it's probably about who's on the team. We've got a 10X programmer, or we've got, they're all senior programmers, or there's some kind of diversity or some kind of lack of diversity or something about the team structure. They found nothing like that. Number one, far and away, the number one thing that characterized their highest performance teams was what they described it with 2 words that I had heard before, but never in context of programming, never in the context of software development. And those 2 words are psychological safety. And interestingly, they said, you can see it. You can observe one of our highest performance teams, and what you will observe is equality in conversational turn taking. No one's silent, no one dominates. There is equality in conversational turn taking. I guess just magical. And command and control executive style, there's nothing that kills self-organization. There's nothing that kills Agile more than a command and control executive style. I've been fired from one of those companies trying to do Agile inside of that kind of a company. That does not work. I was a virus. I was ejected from the body. So I want to do our second poll here. Kent, if you can bring up our second poll and check, you can check as many as you want. Which of these symptoms of Agilists do you see in your current organization, or if you're a consultant, pick out an organization you work with and think about it that way. Again, this is anonymous, so we can't track it back to you.
All right, the answers are coming in. You may want to make sure that you scroll down, because there might be some questions that are below what you're seeing on your screen too.
Yes, there are 9 choices, so you can check as many as 9. So basically everything that's here on my previous slide is in the poll. And I had 10 bullets, so I had to combine 2 into I think Zoom's limited at 9.
All right, it looks like we've got everyone that's going to respond has responded. So let's, I'm going to end the poll. And here are the results. And again, I think you might have to scroll to see all the answers.
Or stretch the box down. Give you a minute to look through those. All right, well, and you may want to take a screenshot to look at it later. Give you 10 more seconds to do that. Okay, so let's now talk about becoming truly agile. And it's much larger than I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes, but I've got 6 that I want to bring up as I think useful to think about. One of them is doing products and not projects, forming teams that to which we bring work as opposed to bringing organizing teams around work. Actually having teams able to own the essence of their work and having an understanding of having every person on that team having an understanding of the difference that they're making. One of the motivational one of the chapters in our book is about motivating engineering teams, and we looked at McGregor, who I had mentioned, his X theory, Y theory. We also looked at a guy named Frederick Hertzberg, who has written the most reprinted Harvard Business Review article ever. Also began his work back in the 1960s. And then he did it across all thought workers. And he did it all data-based. My co-author and I did more of a gut check in tilting it a little bit, just a little bit, but toward more programmers, because that's to whom we were speaking in our book, and listed as the #1 motivator, making a difference in the world. I think there are more of us who got into programming and probably into product management and probably into testing and probably into anything that's got to do with software development because we wanted to make a difference in the world. I remember when I was learning to program, one of the true joys was getting just the smallest programs working and taking them and showing them to my kids or my wife and getting their eyes to light up. That was my objective. And so that's not just making it work. Can I also bring delight? And I think that's the essence of products, not projects. And it's also the essence of being outcomes driven and not output driven. There are my most recent blog post was I don't blog post very often, but my most recent blog post was nearly a year ago, and it began with the words, "Don't ever let velocity or story points be used as a measure of productivity or performance." That's output. We don't care about output. That doesn't matter. Furthermore, it can so easily be gamed that it becomes useless. Point of velocity and story points, or the point of counting stories if you're doing Kanban and doing equal sized stories is about being predictable. It's useful inside the team for being predictable, but it's about output. Outcomes are delighting customers. Are we delighting customers? This is what I count on all of you in product management for, is to just make sure we're delighting customers, make sure that we're doing the right stuff, and really focusing our entire teams on those outcomes. And similarly, focusing our team on the outcomes, not on the process. It's not about Agile. Al Shalloway said, the point is not to be Agile, the point is to be effective. Agile just gives us insights. Respect and trust and psychological safety, we just talked about those. And we need to foment respect and trust and psychological safety as leaders. We have to make sure. I have worked with too many organizations where I hear someone say, well, there's got to be one throat to choke. Where does that and respect, trust, and psychological safety, where's the intersection? I can't find one. We need to collaborate with customers. one of the four values in the Agile Manifesto is not negotiating contract, collaborating with customers to make sure that we are delivering delight to our customers, and having feedback cycles and getting those small stories, not those huge epics, but those small stories to make sure that we are on track for continually delighting our customers. And using the Agile Manifesto as a window. I think too often I see teams that we're agile. We do stand-ups. We do scrums. We do sprint planning. We have WIP limits. We do test-driven development. But it's not about the practices. It's about just as democracy is not about voting and voting machines. It's about the values and principles, and the values and principles are pretty well stated there in the Agile Manifesto. Now, all of you who are in Iowa, so there are a few of us who are not, but all of you who are there in Iowa, I think have a head start. I think I had a head start for growing up in Iowa. I grew up here. I grew up 100 miles northeast of Des Moines and Ames. I grew up on 1,000 acres of corn and soybeans and hay and oats. Half 100 head of cattle and a couple hundred head of hogs. Some silos and barns and those kinds of things. And when I was growing up, there's probably, the interesting thing is that I grew up in a really prosperous community. And I want to emphasize the word community, because there's probably no group of people who are more cussedly independent than programmers than farmers. My dad. But at the same time, my dad, when he took me along when I was a boy, and he took me along to the hardware store or the co-op or the feed store or the church, engaged in conversations with other farmers. And they were constantly sharing what they were trying. They were constantly sharing the new ways of trying things and whether they were working, what was working, and how it was working. They formed that community. And I think that community-ness, and I think it's endemic to Iowa. It's endemic to farmers in Iowa. I think it's broader than that. And so I think you've got a real head start for that teamness, which is coming together into community and forming psychological safety with each other. So with that, let's drop back to questions, and actually let me give you some stuff that you can go look up things or contact me or there's a ton of the studies themselves that you can look at in the study of product team performance, and what I think is applicable particularly on the engineering side of the study of product team performance, the things we've learned about high performance teams. So questions?
All right. If you have any questions for Ron, either go ahead and put them in the chat. Go ahead and put them in the chat if you have any questions. Thanks again, Ron, for joining it. So we do have a question. Can you explain output versus outcome?
Yeah, output. So engineering teams with a great output can still build the wrong thing. They can still build stuff that doesn't delight customers. They can still, I've had an interesting early in training. I'll talk about how did we get to Agile, and we'll talk about waterfall a little bit, because a lot of people have done at least some work in waterfall. In waterfall, you specifically product managers create sometimes whole books of requirements. I will ask how many pages of requirements of those of you who worked in waterfall, and I'll hear sometimes as little as 20, but sometimes as many as 1,000 pages of requirements for a project. And the second question I'll ask is, so, okay, so let's say you got 100 pages of requirements. What percentage of those did you actually deliver? Any guesses? Any guesses what I generally hear? What percentage of 100 pages of requirements for 1,000 or what percentage did we actually deliver? 20%, 10, see coming up in a third. Those are all in the ballpark. So the general ballpark is from 15 to 45%. 15 to 45%. I've heard as little as 5. Sorry to say. And then occasionally I've got a NASA engineer or somebody who's building medical instruments, and I'll hear something in the 90s. It turns out that when we send people into outer space, we want to get them back. And so I'll hear something in the 90s, but more often than not, what I'll hear is in the 15 to 45% range. And so let's take the middle of that. Let's take 25%. 25%, that means that all of you who were product managers in the waterfall days, all of you who were, 75% of what you did was waste. Now, one of the things, and it flows downhill from there, by the way. That means that the architect that in waterfall, it gets turned over to the architects, and they architect a system for that whole set of requirements, and they massively over-architected. And they turn the architecture over to developers who struggle to understand 100 pages or more of requirements and never did. And our testers, meanwhile, were writing test plans for everything in those requirements, and 75% of what they did was waste. But I will often enough ask one more follow-up question, which is, so which 25% did you deliver? Well, that's an interesting question. Which 25% of the requirements did you deliver? I almost never hear the most important. I will hear the easiest. From some teams, I'll hear the hardest, most challenging. The shiniest, that comes up pretty often. The most interesting, the funnest, but almost never the most valuable. That's the difference between outcomes and outputs. Did I answer that adequately? Who asked that question?
I did, thank you.
Right. Another quick question was, are we slides and recordings? Yes, we are recording the session, and I'll post it to the meetup site after it gets processed and everything. Ron, would you be willing to share your slides with us as well?
Yes.
Okay.
I can send them to you, and you can.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
That'd be great. I got another question coming in. What would a stand-up look like that was not a status meeting?
So one of the things, so I'm going to answer that in multiple parts. This is going to be a longer answer. One, I will often people are using Scrum, and Scrum at one time said there were 3 questions, but everybody knows them. And so I'll say, so what are your stand-ups like? And more often than not, I'll hear, well, we answer the 3 questions. And so I'll ask, what are the 3 questions? One of them, I have no argument with. What's standing my way? What's blocking me? I hear it phrased in multiple different ways. 99.9% of the time, the other 2 questions are what I did yesterday and what I'm doing today. And those 3 questions were never about those 2 questions were never about that. They were about, what did I accomplish yesterday on behalf of our team and our plan, and what am I going to accomplish today on behalf of our team and our plan? Because that clues the rest of the team in. Now we've got opportunity to have a conversation. So I come into stand-ups once in a while and hear, well, I worked on the such and such subsystem yesterday, and that's what I'm going to work on again today. It's like, yeah, okay, so where are you? How are you doing? How's that going? Where are we at? Where are we at relative to? One of the things that we're trying to do is to come to as a, if you think about a football huddle, and not the offensive. So the offensive one is directed. It's either coming from the coach or it's coming from the quarterback. But on the defensive side, and there are roles on the defensive side, and most defenses in football. I'm not a sports guy, so you can correct me. But on the defensive side, they have a huddle too. They talk with each other about that. That guy got through, or watch out for that, or look, this is what happened after they did this last time, or they're having those conversations with each other, and they're coming back together for how do we, the goal is win the game. And they're looking at how do we solve that problem for today, and and in Scrum, we're looking at how do we solve that problem for whatever problems we've got for our sprint. And we're looking for how do we solve our problems. What that means is each of us has to be honest with each other of where we're at. So that respect and trust and psychological safety is absolutely necessary for that to happen. And we're trying to figure out, and so one of the things that many teams that I've worked with will do, because I've introduced it to them, but many of them will do a fist of five. So for those of you who haven't done a fist of five, it's an agile practice where we ask a question and you hold up some number of fingers, anywhere from a fist to 5 fingers. And the question is, are we on track to meet our sprint plan? Totally on track to meet our sprint plan. I think we can make our sprint plan. I think we're doing okay. Not a chance in hell we're going to make our sprint plan. It's a really quick way to poll the whole team and find out whether we think we're on track or not, and whether we can adjust. And it may be that everybody, it may be that Ron, I came in and I walked into the code I was working on, and it's just laced with technical debt. I'm waiting in technical debt. I'm sluggishly moving through it instead of what I thought. And I thought it was going to take me a day to work on this thing, and suddenly we're just moving sluggishly through it, and I think it's going to take me 5, and that means that I'm way behind. So can somebody else help me out? Is somebody else ahead? Are we all waiting through technical debt? In which case, we probably should be taking something out of our plan, as opposed to getting to the end of a sprint and discovering that some random thing's not done. Whichever thing happens to not get done, didn't get done. It's an opportunity for a product owner to say, oh, we're not going to get everything done. Here's the thing that we can remove most ably to keep our stakeholders, our executives, and our customers on board with us. Because our stakeholders and executives have granted us autonomy to go work for 2 weeks. And if we come back and if we don't bring back this thing, they're going to be down our throats, and they're going to be spending time in our team room, and they're going to be bothering us, and we're going to go slower than ever before, and all those things are going to happen. And so it's a real opportunity for the team to come together very quickly, figure out where we're all at and how we're doing, and adjust, to restart our game, to go to the dictionary definition of Scrum in rugby.
All right, we actually have a follow-up question to that. So you talked about what a stand-up looks like. It's not a status meeting. How does experimentation look in a stand-up, with that in mind?
So experimentation comes out of retrospectives. And we should have a retrospective at least every couple of weeks. That's what Scrum says. Most Kanban teams figure out how to have retrospectives at least that often. Some Kanban teams and some XP teams tend to have them even daily or multiple times a day. But the goal of a retrospective is what one thing, maybe two, and most three, but what one thing could we try that would make our lives better? That would make us more productive and get our executives and stakeholders to grant us more autonomy. That would make our work more fun. That would make us more joyous. That would raise the quality of what we're doing. What one thing could we try? And it could be about stand-ups. It could be, well, let's try doing a fist of five at the end of our stand-ups. And see whether we're on track by just polling the team that way. It could be revisiting our definition of done because it doesn't seem like it's serving us well. It could be revisiting how we talk to each other on Zoom. It could be any number of things. I find myself in training getting questions that it took me the longest time to realize this, that I was over and over saying, you could retrospect on that.
All right. Do we have any other questions for Ron? Yep. So the question is, why wait for blocking? Oh, so that's kind of why wait. Is that a why wait for stand up to talk about blockers? Is that kind of what that question was intended for? So the question is why should you wait for a stand up to identify things that are blocking you?
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity to self-reflect for everybody in the room. And sometimes you don't realize that you're fighting a blocker unless you self-reflect, and at least once a day you ought to self-reflect. It would obviously be better if we self-reflected all the time, but we're so down in the code. Those of us doing engineering are so down in the testing. Those of us doing testing, or it's not like product managers are busy at all, but they're so busy with being busy that we don't realize it. And so it's a good opportunity to sort of look through our agenda and see whether there are actual blockers there that we want to raise. Now, another thing is that sometimes the blockers are external. I'm missing this thing that somebody outside of our team, outside of our company, sometimes is supposed to provide. And I've been working it, but you all need to know that I'm blocked by that. So some part of it is transparency, some part is visibility, some part of it is self-reflection.
All right. Well, looks like we're kind of out of questions there. So Ron, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Appreciate it very much. As we mentioned, and I'm going to stop recording here. As I mentioned,